There are three possibilities for a person who claims to be a prophet. 1. Liar. He is lying and is aware that he is lying. His goal is to gain power and money. 2. Truth. What he says is true. He is a prophet sent by God. 3. Mentally ill. He also believes what he says, but what he sees and what he hears are epileptic seizures. Drawing such a framework made our work easier. We can reach a conclusion by matching and evaluating these possibilities, one by one, with the information we have. 1. Liar. Let's evaluate the life of the Prophet Muhammad in the light of the first possibility. This claim is generally expressed as follows. Muhammad was a very intelligent person. He said that he met with an angel to change his people and society. Using the influence of religion, he directed his people to political ideas and gained power. In this case, let's use our logic to reason about what kind of work a liar who wants to have power will do. Then let's compare it with what the Prophet Muhammad did. Someone who wants to seize political power does not come up with teachings that are radically opposed to society. A person who wants to get the society behind him would face severe opposition from the society when he comes with such contradictory demands. And that is what happened. He forbade drinking alcohol and prostitution, which were common and popular in the society of the time. He commanded fasting, which required fasting and thirsting all day in the desert heat. He commanded prostration, which was seen as an inferior and slave behavior in Arab culture. Throughout history, people who want to seize power follow a policy that does not clash with the culture of the society, at least until they seize power. But the Prophet Muhammad, who had no power, went out and challenged society with his teachings. In today's society, let us imagine a geography where alcohol is very popular and people are far away from prayer. If you were a liar trying to start a social movement here, would you force them to such opposite obligations to join you? For example, would you be very sensitive about alcohol and order them to pray? Of course, you would not have done so. On the contrary, you would try to rally them behind you by affirming their way of life, as you have witnessed in many examples. The best example of this is the case of Musailamah. After the passing away of Prophet Muhammad, rebellion movements began rapidly. In this environment, a person called Musailamah bin Habib appeared, and he made a sensational claim. He was the new prophet. First, he canceled the ban on alcohol. Then he freed prostitution. Then he canceled the 5 daily prayers. He also reduced the fast to 1 day. With these promises, unlike the Prophet Muhammad, in a very short time he gathered 40,000 supporters. This is what we are trying to explain. The next stop on our questioning adventure is the Valley of Hunain. The Islamic army of 10,000 men led by Prophet Muhammad will fight against the Tayyif tribes of 40,000 men. But wait, what's that? The Islamic army has begun to collapse in the face of a surprise attack by the Taifita. Now only Prophet Muhammad and 100 of his men are left who have not retreated. They are facing an enemy army of 40,000 men, and Prophet Muhammad gives the order to attack. And he begged God to send reinforcements. This time, I won't give spoilers here. You can research the result of the battle. But one thing is certain. This is not the move of a liar. For the Prophet Muhammad, who was extremely brave in battle, one of the most important battles was undoubtedly the Battle of Uhud. Although this battle could have ended in a great victory, the Islamic army was forced to retreat in defeat at the last moment due to a series of mistakes. However, there is another tragic aspect to this battle. The Prophet Muhammad, who had grown up without parents, witnessed the murder of his beloved uncle Hamza by a slave named Washi, and in front of his eyes, his body was tortured unimaginably. Years later, when Islam was in power, the slave Washi came to the Prophet Muhammad and asked for forgiveness. He forgave him and recited the following verses when he could have had him killed and taken revenge for his uncle with a single word of command. This incident, which shows a great example of mercy, shows us that Prophet Muhammad was far from worldly emotions such as greed and revenge. This is not the move of a liar. Now get some rest. It's late. You've had a tiring day, both physically and mentally. You deserve a good sleep. What is that? Would alarm at 2 a.m.? Now you have to get up and pray. Where did this come from? For normal Muslims, prayer is 5 times, but for the Prophet it is 6 times. He has to get up in the middle of the night after sleeping and pray. This obligation has been specifically revealed to the Prophet in a verse. If you were a liar trying to enjoy life, would you impose on yourself the obligation to wake up every night without exception, interrupting your sweet sleep? Not for a day, not a month, not a year, until death. This is not the move of a liar. While there are hundreds more examples, there is not enough time for me to tell you or for you to listen to them. We will conclude Chapter 1 with the last and most outstanding example. After countless assassination attempts and smear campaigns, the leaders of Makkah concluded that they could not defeat Prophet Muhammad by these methods. As a last chance, they planned to offer Prophet Muhammad an incredible amount of money and political power to make him give up his mission.
Let us give you such wealth that you will become the richest man among us. Let's get you married to any woman you want. If you are after honor, let's make you our leader. But just stop criticizing our gods.
We saw that the Prophet Muhammad could not have been a deliberate liar. Even his opponents, who knew his character well, did not make such an accusation. Instead, they interpreted him as mentally ill or under the influence of magic. In this chapter, we will examine whether such a book could really be the product of a human being. When God sends a prophet to a community, he also sends evidence with him. Otherwise, we would not know whom to believe, and the situation would become untenable. For example, Moses' staff turning into a snake, Jesus raising the dead, and so on. So, what evidence was given to the Prophet Muhammad? The answer is the Quran. We cannot directly witness the miracles performed by Jesus, Moses, or other prophets today. However, since Islam is the final religion and addresses all of humanity, there must be a miracle that people on earth can always witness. The most logical way to achieve this is to send a unique book that can be passed down from generation to generation. God has issued a challenge to all humanity in the Quran. First, He allowed all the poets and fortune tellers on earth to gather together and attempt to write a book similar to the Quran. Since this was impossible, He reduced the challenge to 10 surahs. Since this was also impossible, He reduced the challenge to 1 surah. Remember that the shortest surah in the Quran consists of 3 sentences. God is declaring that all of humanity cannot even write 3 sentences similar to the Quran. To understand why this challenge has not been overcome in 1400 years, we need to understand the characteristics of the Quran well. The surahs of the Quran generally have 2 distinct characteristics. The first is their literary perfection. You can understand this from the original Arabic recitations. The second is that they contain deep messages about situations that are often unknown. This is the characteristic we will focus on here. For example, let's examine the shortest surah, which consists of 3 verses. To understand this surah, let us take a short look at the conditions at the time it was revealed. Among the Arabs, lineage is passed down through the male line and is a matter of honor, prestige, and status. The Prophet Muhammad's first son, Qasim, passed away at the age of 17 months, and years had passed since his death. After Qasim, his daughters were born, grew up, and married. When his second son, Abdullah, passed away as an infant, the pagan Meccans began to spread the rumor that his lineage could not continue and called him Ebter. Imagine how distressing and overwhelming this situation must have been for Prophet Muhammad, who was not only a prophet but also a human being, especially since he had recently lost his child while the pagan Meccans made fun of him. The term Ebter is used for those whose lineage has been cut off, and no one will remember them with honor or respect. In this surah, it is stated that the true Ebter is not Muhammad, but the Meccans who said this to him, and a definitive judgment is made about the future. Subsequently, despite the prophet having no male children, his lineage continued to influence the world until the day we live in, and the people of Mecca who made fun of him at the time died one by one in battles. They disappeared without even having a tombstone, while their children became Muslims and did not even mention them with honor, dignity, or respect, thus becoming the true Ebter themselves. The prophet and his lineage, however, are still praised and honored in prayers performed around the world every day. Hello?
Hello, I am listening to your program, but I have an objection here. Here, the claimant claims that he will be successful and then says, "I told you so." This is a simple logical fallacy. There are many people in the world who claim to be successful and are successful, and many who are not. If they were not successful, we would not be discussing these today. Thank you.
Yes, you're right. That alone doesn't mean anything. We were just warming up. Now, let me give you a much more dramatic example. We go back to the 7th century. The Eastern Romans and the Persians are engaged in a brutal struggle. The pagans of Mecca see the Persians as closer to themselves because they are fire worshippers, while the Muslims see the Romans as closer to themselves because they are people of the book. In the war between the Eastern Romans and the Persians had been victorious for over 10 years and had gained a significant psychological advantage. At the same time, they had allied with the Avars, surrounding the Eastern Roman Empire from 2 directions and advancing as far as the gates of Constantinople. The Eastern Roman Empire's economic and military systems had collapsed, morale was exhausted, and they were in a state of despair. Emperor Heraclius was even thinking of fleeing Constantinople. The end of the Eastern Roman Empire was near. At that moment, something very strange happened, and the following verses were revealed. And this verse had a shocking effect on everyone. Making such a claim when the Eastern Roman Empire was on the point of collapse was like saying that Germany would recover in the summer of 1945 and win World War II. The prophet's opponents were delighted with this claim because in their view it would clearly prove that Muhammad was a liar. Could such a thing really happen? Time would tell. And then, just as in the verse, everything began to turn around in a way that historians still describe as interesting today. The Eastern Roman Empire began a sudden recovery process. They made an agreement with the Avars and removed the pressure from the north. It re-established its military order, marched on the Persians, and pursued them all the way to the interior of Iran. It was a twist of fate that on the same day, the Muslims defeated the pagan Meccans in the Battle of Badr. Whether it was a twist of fate or the news in this verse is left to your judgment. The explanation of how all this happened is given in the 5th verse. From that period to the present day, fortune tellers have made many absurd predictions about the future. For example, they make 10 predictions, 2 of which come true, and then try to attract attention based on those. In the Quran, however, there is no other verse that contains claims such as, "This will happen at this time in the future," other than the Roman-Persian War. Now let's go back in time a little further, to ancient Egypt. In the Quran, it is described how Pharaoh pursued Moses, how Moses split the sea, and how Pharaoh drowned while pursuing him. After this description, the verse states, "The heavens and the earth did not weep for him." The meaning behind this phrase has remained unclear for centuries. There is no similar expression or reference to it anywhere else in the Quran. Why is it specifically said of Pharaoh that the heavens and the earth did not weep for him? If the Quran is a book that cannot be replicated even in a single surah, there must be a deeper truth behind this. Egyptian hieroglyphic texts deciphered in the early 19th century show that this expression was used in literary works written to praise the pharaoh in ancient Egypt. These writings date back to before the time of Jesus. We see that the Quran, which tells us about the unknown future, also tells us about the unknown past.
The Quran states that the Bible and the Torah were sent by God, and there are many common narratives. For this reason, claims such as the Quran was copied from the Bible and the Torah have been made many times to this day. Finally, in this section, we will examine the strange similarities and strange differences between the Quran and the Bible and the Torah. The books and languages that need to be known in order to transfer the narratives of that period to the Quran are as follows. At that time, none of these books had been translated into Arabic, and they were not even known in the Arab world through oral tradition. The first Arabic translation of all these books was made after the Prophet Muhammad. It is also worth noting that most of these apocryphal texts were discovered in Egypt in 1945. These texts had been completely destroyed by Orthodox Christians during the early struggles of Christianity. Therefore, it was impossible for these sources to be known in writing or orally in the region where the Prophet Muhammad lived. There is still no scientific explanation for how a person could have obtained such knowledge on their own under those conditions at that time. There was no internet, no Google, no Translate, and certainly no ChatGPT. What is even more remarkable is that these stories seem to have been filtered through an invisible process, freeing them from errors as they were incorporated into the Quran. Let us briefly examine 3 examples. The Torah mentions pillars of the world in many places. At that time, the flat worldview in which the earth and sky were held up by pillars was prevalent. Interestingly, the term pillar also appears in the Quran, but with a slight difference. The Quran mentions that the sky was built without pillars. When quoting from the Torah, our invisible filter has corrected this error. In our second example, we see a person named Haman. In the Quran, Haman is referred to as Pharaoh's assistant, while in the Torah, he is referred to as the assistant of the Persian king. At first, it was claimed that this was an error in the Quran and that the name seen in the Torah was used incorrectly in the wrong place. However, in hieroglyphic texts that were later deciphered, it was seen that such a person actually existed in ancient Egypt, and even the closeness of his relationship with the pharaoh was described. This was also information that was impossible to obtain during the time of the Prophet Muhammad. However, the invisible filter resolved this as well. Finally, let us look at this example. While the Bible refers to the sun as a great light and the moon as a lesser light, the Quran's version deepens this distinction considerably. When referring to the sun, it uses the word sirach. This word is used in Arabic for things that emit light on their own, such as lamps or fire. For things illuminated by light reflected from somewhere else, the term nuran or munira is used. Thus, the nuance of the words chosen in the verse indicates that the sun is a source of light, while the moon is more of a reflector of light rather than a true source of light. The invisible filter details are quite remarkable.
Yes, we have seen many things so far, but what we have seen is perhaps less than 1% of what we have not seen. While there are hundreds of similar details we could discuss, I have chosen to present only a few of the most easily understood ones. The fact is that these studies and discussions are endless. What you need to do here is to make a choice based on your own free will. You are completely free to believe or not to believe. Nevertheless, it is similar to this. You play heads or tails with your friend 50 times. He says tails every time, and tails comes up 50 times in a row. This is not scientifically impossible, but whether you believe the coin is trick or not is up to your way of thinking. Imagine that 1400 years ago, a man emerged from the ignorance and poverty of the desert, claimed to be a prophet, and presented a book that would shape human history and is still being passionately debated 1400 years later. Yes, here we are slowly saying goodbye and parting ways. In Chapter 2, we focused on the striking truths of the Quran, but overlooked its literary perfection. All these striking details we discussed are in fact presented through this perfect literature. I leave you with a brief recitation of the Quran.
لو أنزلنا هذا القرآن على جبل لرأيته خاشعا متصدعا من خشية الله وتلك الأمثال نضربها للناس لعلهم يتفكرون هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو عالم الغيب والشهادة هو الرحمن الرحيم هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن المهيمن العزيز الجبار المتكبر سبحان الله عما يشركون هو الله الخالق البارئ المصور له الأسماء الحسنى يسبح له ما في السماوات والأرض وهو العزيز الحكيم